So our guest this evening probably doesn't need an introduction, but I think it's the customary thing to give one anyway. Lord Andrew Adonis, Labour member of the House of Lords, who served in both the Blair and the Brown governments as Minister for Schools and as the Secretary of State for Transport. He's just published Ernest Bevin, Labour's Churchill, and he's been a vocal critic of Brexit and a supporter of remaining in the EU for the last 4 years and beyond. He's a regular contributor to the New European. He's vice chair of European Movement. And I think my personal favourite accomplishment is the accolade he received from Charles Moore of the Telegraph, the most Remainery Remainer that there is. So welcome, croeso, Andrew. I think the only place we can start really is what's been going on in the past 10 days. There's been another extraordinary week in the world of Brexit. UK government breaking international law, going back on a treaty it made less than a year ago, devolution under threat, Johnson now saying a no-deal Brexit is a good outcome. Can you give us your take on where we are now and where we might be heading?
Helen, it's great to be with you, and great to be with all of those who are on this on the line with Wales for Europe. In the campaign, which if things had gone slightly differently last year, we could have won for a second referendum. I was just calculating. I think I did 8 meetings in Wales during the course of it. I was in Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, Rhyl, Ynys Môn, Ebbw Vale, and 1 or 2 other places in the valleys. So I spent a day doing meetings in the valleys. So my only regret is I'm not physically in Wales at the moment. That's a huge regret of mine, not least the South Wales, because one of my big acts as Transport Secretary was authorising the new intercity trains, which now go to Cardiff and Swansea, and the electrification of the line through to Swansea, which is now taking place. That's happening very slowly, though unfortunately since then the government's cut it back to Cardiff, which I think is a huge mistake. And one of my great lines at the time, which I'm afraid just tells you so much about the modernisation that we need to carry through as a country, was that then, 11 years ago, Wales was the only nation in Europe apart from Albania without a single mile of electrified railway. And that isn't something we should be proud of. It's something we need to modernise. And how do we bring about the big modernisation and advance that we need? It has to be as part of Europe. It's not going to be by becoming an insular offshore attempt at Singapore, which will almost certainly lead to us all being worse off. So the arguments haven't basically changed since last year. But of course, we had an election because of the catastrophic mistake of the leader of my party, I'm afraid, as much as anyone else, Jeremy Corbyn, to go for a general election before a referendum. We had a general election. People didn't want Corbyn as Prime Minister, and so we got Boris Johnson in. And as I see the situation now, 8 months later, there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is that he's going to be in office for some time. Brexit has happened. We're not going to be able to reverse it in the short term. And it's pretty bad. I mean, we've got a populist, xenophobic government led by Johnson with his, I'd like to say evil genius, but I can't see any signs of the genius in Dominic Cummings. And it is playing a kind of sub-Trump theme. And it's bad. It's going to lead to not just to leaving the European Union, but to a hard form of Brexit, completely out of the political institutions, completely out of the single market, completely out of freedom of movement for the next generation of people. So it's bad, and it's I'm afraid not going to get better in that sense. The good news, though, is that they are unbelievably incompetent. And with incompetence comes, in due course, because we are a democracy, unpopularity. And because the effects of Brexit layered on top of the effects of COVID-19 are going to be bad for our economy, more unemployment, fewer well-paid jobs, less opportunities for young people. Over time, I think that the mood will change in response to Europe, particularly since there never was a second referendum. So I think the sense of us being dragged out of Europe against our wishes will become increasingly pronounced as it becomes unpopular. And we're already seeing that if you just look at what's happened over the last few weeks over this ludicrous breach of international law and ripping up of the Northern Ireland Protocol and so on. That will almost certainly be reversed by the House of Lords. And though I think it's actually basically a kind of power play in the negotiations for the free trade agreement, which they're trying to negotiate at the moment. So I don't think it was ever his intention to do no deal, let alone to end the Northern Ireland Protocol. Bit by bit, this chips away at the credibility of the government and the whole Brexit project. And bit by bit, I think that gives us our opportunity to shift the debate. So that leads to the last point I want to make, which is of real importance, which is that we absolutely must remain vigorous and campaigning on Europe. It's very important to understand we didn't lose the argument last year. What happened was the politicians completely messed up. If there had been a second referendum, I believe we would have won it. The parties who were committed to a second referendum, and most of their members, most of the Greens, Lib Dems, Nationalist parties, Labour members were in favour of staying in. They got more votes than the Conservative Party and the Brexit Party together last year. And we are a democracy, and I think ultimately the majority will assert itself, but it will only do so if we remain vigorous and campaign. And what does that mean at the moment? Obviously, there isn't an option at the moment to campaign to rejoin, in the sense that there isn't a referendum coming up, and nor is there a general election with a party that's proposing to rejoin. So what we're doing at the moment is keeping the European flame alive, and doing so with, I believe, every prospect of us being able to turn that into a viable political campaign to rejoin in due course. And that means keeping true by the work that we do together as campaigners. It means championing European culture. It means championing opportunities for the closest possible relationship we can have with the European Union at every stage. It means in all of the walks of life in which we operate, doing the thing which is going to lead to a positive, not a negative view of Europe. So if we're involved in education, and there are lots of us who are involved in education as teachers, as lecturers and so on, doing our best to forge strong relationships with European friends, schools, colleges, universities, promoting exchanges. It means all of these things that we can do in our own small way and as a group. And Wales is a great and proud nation, and Wales for Europe can do big things, both inside the European movement and with partner organisations on the continent. And I believe that if we continue to do those things, then because our message is right, because I believe it never lost its popularity actually, because Brexit will unravel as an economic and a political project, and because of the sheer incompetence of Johnson and Cummings, I think that the moment when we're able to turn the tide will come sooner than we think. So I'm basically an optimist. I think there's everything still to play for. If you just look at what's happening in the last fortnight, there's such a level of malevolence and incompetence on the other side that fires us up to want to campaign for Europe anyway, as well as us giving us the opportunity actually to make a difference. And I think we should just keep at it. And we all went a bit quiet after the election. I did myself actually, partly because I was busy writing my book, and Helen very kindly gave it a plug. This is it. Ernie Bevin, Labour's Churchill. And part of the reason I wrote it was I wanted to understand. You know, Ernie Bevin was a great foreign secretary after 1945, who was in many ways very strongly pro-European. He was the guy who was critical in the creation of West Germany and a free and democratic Western Europe. He didn't go along with the early stages in the formation of the European Union, but I think that was very much to do with British politics in 1950 and his own belief that the European Union as it became would never take off. But he was an arch pragmatist. I have no doubt at all that an Ernie Bevin in politics today, not only would he have been in favour of staying in the European Union, I cannot conceive he would have wanted to leave it, because he was never in favour of leaving successful democratic political projects. But I believe actually his own ability to appeal across classes, across the country, mobilising the working class in the way he did as a very great trade union leader, would have, if he'd been around in the 2010s, that would have avoided the catastrophe of the 2016 referendum. And it's exactly that kind of approach to politics that we need to bring about the big change in public attitudes, which I hope in due course will enable us to rejoin the European Union. And just a final comment to underline the point about optimism. The biggest mistake that we made after the war was not to join the nascent European Union, the European Coal and Steel Community, when it was founded in 1951. And it took us about 10 years to realise that was a mistake. We failed to join in 1951. Harold Macmillan, who was an extraordinarily able Conservative Prime Minister, made the first application to join the European Union exactly 10 years later in 1961. And 10 years, actually 11 years after that, in 1972, we joined. Now, it could all have happened more quickly. I wish we'd applied to join in the mid-50s rather than 1961. And actually, but for General de Gaulle, we would have got into the European Union a lot more quickly. But a sea change takes place in political and public attitudes to what became the European Union between 1951, when we decided not to go in it, and both parties, both Labour and the Conservatives, agree with that, not to go into the beginning of the European Union. A sea change takes place between then and Harold Macmillan only a few years later, and of course we're in within 10 years after that. So don't believe that just because the going is tough at the moment, this means we can't change public attitudes fast and dramatically. And the fact that there never was a second referendum, so we never did get the verdict of the British people as to whether they did want to leave the European Union on the dreadful terms that were on offer last year and this year. I think that is what gives us huge credibility in the period ahead, that we can say, because actually we believe it to be true, that had the British people been consulted on the actual terms of Brexit, they wouldn't have agreed to it. We're a democracy. Ultimately, the people's will shine through. And so I think there's everything to play for, not just in the coming months, as we go from shambles to shambles with Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, but in the next few years ahead, where I'm confident that we can bring about a rapid change in public attitudes and create political opportunities that could lead to an opportunity to rejoin much sooner than people think at the moment. Helen, there you are. That's to kick off the discussion, and also to, I think, give you a real sense of the importance of what we're doing and why it's well worth giving up an hour or two this evening, but also a lot of time hereafter.
Thank you. I think we will have some more questions about the detail of what's going on at the moment and your take of that soon. But I wanted to pick up on what you said around the sort of longer term, the cultural change, attitudes changing, the opinion shifting, and that aspect of our work, which is very important to us at Wales for Europe. But of course, this has been a political project for the last 4 years. What do you think at this stage the political path back to the EU might possibly look like?
Well, I think the first thing that's got to happen is that this extreme Brexit project has got to be seen to be failing. Now, it will only be seen to be failing once it's started properly. And I mean, it could start properly very soon if the negotiations break down and Johnson and Cummings hurtle over the edge of a cliff. That's not what I think will happen. I think the past is always the best guide to the future. And what's happening at the moment is very silly and cheap brinkmanship of a kind we had last year. Do you remember when we had Grayling hiring the ferry companies with no ferries and all of those ludicrous no-deal preparations in the middle of last year, which were all basically a process of brinkmanship. But when it came to the crunch, Boris Johnson did the deal, actually almost exactly a year ago, last October. He did the deal with Leo Varadkar. He actually negotiated the Northern Ireland Protocol, which made it possible to get the extension, which meant we didn't go off the edge of a cliff. Now, my reading of what's going on at the moment is that that's probably what's going to happen now. I would put our odds on that quite high. The actual issues outstanding in the negotiation for this free trade agreement at the moment aren't great. They're to do with rules on state aid, which is government subsidies of industry, and fishing quotas. Those are essentially the two issues. Now, the ambitions, of course, in a sense, are quite limited, because what that will do is get a free trade agreement, which means that goods can pass freely through the ports without tariffs and without quotas or customs duties. But of course, that's only a fraction of the benefits we got from the European Union before. We were full members of the single market, we had a big part in shaping the rules, we had freedom of movement, and we were part of all the political institutions of the EU too. So what, assuming that he does do some kind of Canada-type free trade deal, what I think will happen is that from next January, when that takes effect, we will start to experience just lower growth and less good economic prospects than the two big countries that we compare ourselves with on the continent, which are France and Germany. And I don't know, it's very hard to predict, but how quickly that will manifest itself. But I suspect fairly quickly, actually, because the thing about lower growth rates is they make themselves felt quite quickly. You know, 1 or 2 percentage points less growth each year, you know, just as compound interest mounts up fast, so in politics and economics, compound decline mounts up quite fast, particularly given the weak position that Britain starts from with the chronic mishandling by this government of the COVID-19 crisis, where we're clearly coming out of it in a much worse economic condition than most of the continent. So I think when you ask Helen, what is the trajectory? I think what we need to do for the immediate future is simply to be preaching the word, that we still believe in Europe, we think it was a mistake to be leaving, doing all our bit in our local communities as well as in Wales for Europe to establish strong European links. I think it's particularly important that schools, colleges, universities, workplaces all do, those of us who are engaged in them, all do everything we can to forge real links with European partners. You know, every school in Wales, why doesn't it have, if it doesn't already have one, a partner school in on the continent, which is a real meaningful partnership, so that this European link continues to be real and a deep cultural link, not just a political message. And then as the Brexit project starts to unravel in terms of being a successful political and economic project, then I think we can exploit the opportunities. I can't predict exactly how they'll develop. It could be that that we can persuade one of the big parties, hopefully my party, the Labour Party, that at the next election they should stand for an avowedly pro-EU message, maybe a referendum with the option to go back in again. It's hard to predict at the moment, but the stronger we are as campaigners, the better position we'll be in to exploit the unravelling of the Brexit project, which I'm convinced will start to happen once it takes effect from next January. And that is absolutely why we should continue campaigning, and both politically, but also, as I say, in all of the areas that we are involved in as individuals and as groups.
You talk about the Labour Party and the position you hope that they will adopt. What is your take on the strategy that Keir Starmer is using at the moment, the sort of keep quiet, push back onto Johnson? I think a lot of people in the pro-European movement are torn between understanding the wisdom of that strategy and feeling deeply frustrated by it and by the party not speaking out. So I'd be interested to hear your view on that.
Well, Keir Starmer is clearly concerned to broaden his message out from Brexit, and particularly as he was the Brexit spokesperson of the Labour Party before he became the leader. My reading of what he's seeking to do at the moment is that he's very anxious not to be pigeonholed just as secure Brexit. That's his big concern. And I do understand that, because of course we did spend pretty well the entirety of last year as you know, across the United Kingdom talking about Brexit and almost nothing else. However, what you can't do is to duck when actual big immediate issues come up. And to be fair to Keir, he hasn't ducked on this breach of international law. And you know, Ed Miliband's speech yesterday was a brilliant speech, foursquare against this latest ludicrous and very, very damaging move by Johnson and Cummings. So he hasn't vacated the field entirely. And my own view is that the more credible a pro-European message in the sense of a closer engagement with the European Union, possibly leading to rejoining, the more credible that message becomes over the next 2 to 3 years, the more ready he'll be to embrace it. So the position he's adopting at the moment is he's not going to go along with really stupid and damaging things that, that Boris Johnson is proposing, and he's shown that in the last fortnight in the way he's handled the, this crisis on breaking international law and the withdrawal agreement. But nor is he going to lead the campaign for a pro-EU position. And I think, to be blunt, we are going to have to do that, both we, the European movement, Wales for Europe, and all of our local groups, but also those of us who are in the Labour Party and in whichever other party we're in, because there'll be people on in this Zoom call who are members of Plaid and the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, maybe some Conservatives who are pro-European as well. And what we all need to do is to exert ourselves within our political spheres as well as the European movement, and hand in hand with, as I say, the growing implosion of Brexit, which I think will happen after next January. I think we will be able to encourage our political leaders to move back into not just a general pro-European position, which I don't think Keir will vacate, but an actual pro-EU position, which is where I hope we can get to again by the next general election.
Thank you. Of course, the other aspect of the internal market bill, which has been causing a lot of concern, particularly here, has been the attack on devolution, the giving to Westminster spending powers over areas that are devolved. The view that the internal market vision that is being proposed will mean that Wales and Scotland as well are not able to pass regulation in the way that we would want to, or that our government would want to. And I think there are a few things coming together here. There's the EU regulation was, I think, the thing that held the four nations together in terms of regulation. It was an external framework. So we've got the very practical challenge around regulation. We've got a Conservative government currently putting forward, I think, what is perceived as an aggressively unionist view and a very, very centralising view at that. We've also got a huge increase in support for Welsh independence here. I think Welsh independence in May was polling at 32% of those who said who would vote. We had a poll last month that said 51% of people who voted for Labour in the 2019 general election would support full independence. So my questions in this area are, what can hold the union together post-Brexit? We always knew that Brexit would be incredibly challenging. Will the Labour Party in Westminster defend the devolution settlement, do you think, as part of the internal market bill? And we've also had questions from people asking, is it actually a time for a dramatic change in the status of Wales?
Well, I wouldn't presume to tell you what should happen to the status of Wales hereafter. I think that's absolutely an issue for the Welsh people. But do I think that what's happening is a threat to the union? Yes, absolutely. It clearly is, because it's not just that the European institutions and European policies and European structural funds and so on help to bind us together, but we're all part of a shared project which recognised our diversity, but within a wider democratic context, and that's now being clearly lost. And you're absolutely right that the internal market bill, the most objectionable feature is the power to completely override international law, including the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, which the government negotiated. But the second is the presumption also that the government in Westminster can simply impose on the devolved administrations in areas which had previously, where they previously dealt directly with the European institutions. So we should definitely attack those elements which impair the devolution settlement. And Labour has been doing that. And I'm absolutely sure that we will continue to do that. And of course, the best, I mean, I personally think it will be a tragedy if we ended up carving up the United Kingdom and having complete independence. I myself personally believe in democratic unions, just as I'm strongly in favour of the European Union as a democratic union where the sum is more than the parts. I think the same is true of the United Kingdom too. But I absolutely believe that must be on the basis of respecting devolution, including being prepared to enhance it where that's a sensible course of action. And it certainly shouldn't involve clawing back powers to the United Kingdom government, which were previously devolved. And I think that that's a terrible mistake, and it will do more to stimulate independence feeling than anything else, because that's not going to be the direction that the United Kingdom goes in over the next decade or two.
So another question in relation to our situation here in Wales. Of course, we've got the Senedd elections coming up next May. I think unlike Scotland, which people feel is fairly predictable as things stand, the landscape is looking that there could be some quite significant changes here. We had the Welsh Political Barometer poll out earlier this week suggesting gains for Plaid, gains for the Conservative Party in the Senedd, perhaps up to 8 seats won. So one of our goals as Wales for Europe, of course, would be to maintain a pro-European government in the Senedd, whatever colour that might be. I wondered if you have any reflections, thinking back to the last general election, on what can be done differently and what lessons we might want to learn from that campaign?
Well, it was a disastrous Labour campaign, and I was in several North Wales seats during it because of friends who were standing, and it was a terrible experience. I don't draw the lesson from it, by the way, that our problem was Brexit. The lesson I draw from it was that, to be blunt, Labour has to have an electable leader, and we didn't have one last year. And we have to have a sensible manifesto, and we need to improve on that too. And when it comes to Europe, and it's important to get the history right so we can work out where we go hereafter. Though, of course, there was, I mean, because there had been a narrow no vote in leave vote in Wales in the 2016 referendum, though there was some quite strong feeling in a pro-Brexit direction, which I think did play a part in some of those seats going Conservative. It was also the case that the pro-Europeans, so I think we're in the majority in these seats, felt very disillusioned because they faced a Labour leader who wouldn't even say how he would campaign in a second referendum. So we weren't even able, not only were we losing votes, which we were inevitably going to do, I think, from people who were, as it were, hardcore Brexiters who really did want to see the whole Brexit thing delivered, but we weren't able to rally the pro-European vote in the way that we should. So what are the lessons that I draw from that? They're in good part about leadership, that we need good and credible leadership. And I'm glad to say Keir Starmer's a good leader. I think Mark Drakeford's doing a perfectly good job as well. So I don't think that that's such a big problem now. Indeed, I don't think it ever was such a big problem in the Senate in Wales. It was more of a problem for the Labour Party nationally. We need that, but we also will, in due course, need a clear position on Europe. And where does the European movement and Wales for Europe come in? I think in due course, we just need to choose our timing right. It is definitely to put strong pressure on the political parties to take the most pro-EU position that is credible in the run-up to the next election. Now, I can't say at the moment here in 2020 what's going to be the most credible pro-European position in, say, 2023. We're in the run-up to the next general election. But whatever it is, we should be out there campaigning for it. And if we've been campaigning really hard over the next few years, of course, we'll make a more pro-EU position credible to start with. So I hope that gives a decent answer to the question. There are big lessons that need to be learnt from last year. A lot of them, as I say, are about leadership and I think are being learnt. But where Wales for Europe is in a very good position to talk to the political parties is that it also needs to include a credible policy on Europe. And a good part of what went wrong last year was that the naturally pro-European parties, particularly Labour and the Liberal Democrats for different reasons, didn't have credible policies. We had Jeremy Corbyn, who wouldn't even say how he would campaign in a second referendum, which clearly wasn't credible. And unfortunately, the Lib Dems had a policy of reversing Brexit without a referendum that I don't think was credible either. So it's achieving credibility that is hugely important, but maximising our sway on the political parties in the run-up to the next election to make that the policy we go into the next election with.
So on a link note, we have found in Wales that sort of civil society has been relatively quiet in the 2016 referendum, and actually increasingly quiet as we've moved forward over the past 4 years. Who do you think are the people we need to be pushing to be our allies? And I guess this may link to a question that came up in the chat about where the biggest gaps are going to be in the agreement that we do get with the EU or that we don't get, and therefore which sectors are going to be hardest hit?
Well, taking those in reverse order, anything that relates to trade in services is going to be hit from next January because we won't be members of the single market. So financial and business services, pretty well all traded services that deal with the continent are going to be badly hit. Universities are going to be badly hit. Indeed, I'm already noticing what's happening there. There's been a big onrush of students. I was talking to a Vice-Chancellor this morning. There's been a massive rush of students coming in from the EU, actually despite COVID, for this September, because it's the last year you're going to be able to get access to the loans arrangements if you're an EU student. So both on the student front and also on the research front, we're going to be increasingly badly hit. And of course, for young people, the opportunities to study and work on the continent are going to be drastically reduced from next year. And that's why I think schools, colleges, universities are hugely important for bringing about a change in public attitudes. And if I were looking at the places where I'd really want to get going on mobilising Wales for Europe and changing public attitudes, it's in educational institutions first and foremost, partly because they are going to be so badly affected by Brexit itself, but also because, of course, they're full of people who are good at mobilising, at making their voices heard. And it's the younger generation, I think, by which I mean, all younger people who are in jobs and universities at the beginning of their careers, as well as those at school, who, as they start to make their voices heard, I think that could bring about quite a big and rapid change in the political parties. The good thing about the pro-Remain case, the pro-EU case over the last 4 years, is it's been overwhelmingly popular amongst the young. Indeed, Femi, remember Femi? I remember him pointing out to me that actually, if you just held everything else constant, just by demographic change, last January, we'd won the 2016 referendum, if you'd rerun it. The new people who were able to vote and the people who wouldn't have voted because they're no longer with us. So providing we can keep that as the position, that younger people are strongly pro-Europe and pro-EU, then that will make it much, much easier to bring about a rapid change in public attitudes and the political parties.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in some questions now that we've been having. Neil Schofield Hughes sent a question in advance. Neil, are you with us?
Right, yes. I was having some issues on muting myself. Good evening, Andrew. Hello. The question that I had actually derived from the internal market bill and obviously the absolute importance of that. Last week, you made a statement in the House of Lords in which you said very clearly that not only should the House of Lords reject the bill, but that it was actually the House of Lords' duty, that it must reject the bill on the logic that it traduced the Salisbury Agreement. Now, what concerned me about that is that in all of this, I suspect that Johnson and Cummings would relish a peers versus the people battle. So how would you deal with that risk, and in what ways do you feel that organisations and groups like ours could actually help support the House of Lords and your colleagues as you go through this process?
Well, I don't think we've got, my own view is that I don't think we've got any choice but to seek to reject the bill, because it is a flagrant and very serious breach of international law, and it imperils the Good Friday Agreement. And on the constitutional principle that the House of Lords shouldn't agree to things that aren't in party manifestos where they're deeply controversial, we're on a good ground there too. So I don't think we've got any choice in the matter. It might, is my view. However, there's a tactical thing, which is how do we go about it? How do we go about the rejection? And I'm very hopeful that it will be led in the House of Lords by senior Conservatives. Two former leaders of the Conservative Party who are in the House of Lords, William Hague and Michael Howard, have denounced the serious breach of international law and the threat to the peace process in Northern Ireland. William Hague in today's Telegraph, his whole column in today's Telegraph is why the internal market bill will undermine British foreign policy and credibility, because it depends upon our word being trusted internationally. How can we lecture the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians on observing international law when we breached ourselves? So what I'm hoping will happen is that the charge against the bill in the Lords will be led not just by Conservatives, but by very senior Conservatives, hopefully by two former leaders of the Conservative Party. Now, that makes it harder to do a peers versus people attack if this is an argument inside the Conservative Party as much as an argument between the Lords and the Commons. That's the first point. But the second point is we have got to be absolutely resolute in our makings of the arguments. We mustn't let Johnson get away with this argument that somehow, I mean, it's a ludicrous argument he's making, that somehow he's doing this to protect the Good Friday Agreement. How can having a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland be protecting the Good Friday Agreement? It's the whole reason why we had the Northern Ireland Protocol. So we need to deal with the arguments and be much more robust on those than we have been often in the past. But also we need to be tactically astute. And as I say, I'm hopeful that tactically this can be presented, because it is the truth, as an argument within the Conservative Party. And of course, if we can start dividing the Brexit Conservative Party, because remember, both Hague and Howard are pro-Brexit. If we can start dividing the Brexit Conservative Party into, as it were, the responsible wing that at least wants to play by the law, and the provisional wing, if I can sort of choose my metaphor, which is Johnson and Cummings, who seem to be, adopting a kind of Maoist attitude, then I think that will make a lot of sensible people, including people who voted for Brexit, worry about what's going on. So I'm not, Neil, minimising the issue you raise. Of course it's an issue, and we'll get enemies of the people, just as the Supreme Court got, it was the Daily Mail enemies of the people over page after page when they stood up for the rule of law a year ago in the prorogation crisis, when Johnson tried to send Parliament away for the best part of 3 months. So we'll certainly get that. But I think if we can maximise the extent to which the campaign is led by Conservatives against this abuse of the law, and be much more agile in making the arguments, which is where Wales for Europe and all our pro-European groups are so important, then I think we can win this.
Thank you. I'm really, you sound very convinced that sort of dealing with the arguments, that sort of fact-based approach, still has mileage. I know a lot of people are feeling very much as if that there is no way to make arguments at the moment, and that actually, should we not be talking about Brexit? Is it this toxic thing? Do we need to put the word to sleep? What do you think to that view, that sort of what Johnson is trying to do is, I suppose, reignite the debate from last year to try and kick up the same kind of situation, to divide us again on the Leave Remain point? Do we need to drop the term Brexit? Do we need to make sure we stop talking about Leave and Remain? And do you think what he's doing at the moment is gaining traction with the public?
Well, the word remain is clearly problematic because we've left. So there clearly is a language thing that we need to address. But do I think that that when you're dealing with very big issues, the way to deal with them is to ignore them? That's not my experience of politics or life at all. It might be a short-term palliative if you don't know what to do. I mean, it's better to say nothing than to make a complete fool of yourself. You know, what's the old saying that I wasn't sure if he was a fool until he opened his mouth. You know, I mean, there's so you do need to be sure you know what you're going to say. But I don't believe that the reason why we have so far lost the Brexit thing is because we lost the arguments. That's not my view. I'm not even convinced it's because we lost the vote, if you follow me, because we lost the initial referendum, but the only vote that happened after that was two general elections. And in both of those general elections, and this is the crucial point, the pro-Remain, that is the pro-EU forces, were terribly led. Terribly led. I mean, my party, the Labour Party, was led by somebody who, the best that can be said is that they were quasi-Brexiter. You know, there wasn't actually a strong pro-EU leadership. It's very, very hard to win an argument if you've got very bad leadership. So my own view is that the right lesson to draw from what happened in the last 4 years is that we need good leadership, and we need to mobilise our arguments better than we had done in the past, and we need to relate them to people's everyday experience better than we did in the past. But because I don't believe we actually lost the argument, I therefore don't think that what we should do is stop talking about the issue. On the contrary, I think if we'd been properly led, we would have won. And it never came to the test, because the only opportunity that people had to pass a verdict on Brexit, as it was last year, was in a general election where the big choice they faced was, did you want Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister? And let's be frank, that was an absolutely terrible choice to put before the British people. So I certainly don't think we should go silent on the issue. I don't think we should stop talking about the elephant in the room, because it's evidently there. And whilst I think we need to be mindful of keeping our language in line with the reality, and I think, as I say, we need to think very carefully about what we call our campaign, given that Remain clearly is a meaningless concept now that we've left. I certainly don't think we should stop talking about Brexit, because it is one of the biggest things that's going to affect people's living standards, their quality of life, and particularly if they're a young person making their way in the world, all of their opportunities and ability to get on.
I think we have a question from Louise Cahill, which follows on well from this.
Hello there, can you hear me okay? Excellent. As a registered nurse in the NHS, I've seen the incredible pressure our services have been put under during COVID-19. I've also seen the increasing drug shortages that we're experiencing even before COVID came along. We're told by the government that plans to manage the huge additional pressure that Brexit will put on the supply of medicines are in place. But healthcare workers and organisations such as Diabetes UK have warned that these plans are not robust. Compound this by the survey that showed that EU workers in the NHS said that they would leave the NHS if a no deal occurs and leave the UK. The reality of the state of healthcare in 2021 looks pretty bleak. How do we help the public understand these real threats that they face, particularly to their health, through the layers of nationalism and misrepresented facts and polarised views that we're facing?
Well, I think whilst the COVID-19 crisis is going on, it's going to be tough, because the overwhelming focus of the NHS and all those of you who do such a great job in it is obviously dealing with this immediate crisis of the pandemic. But once we get the vaccine, which of course is going to come at some point in the next year, and we're able to move on from it, then I think people in the NHS will start talking about Brexit and the impact of Brexit as they were very much before COVID-19 came on. And actually, I think one of the reasons why it'd be quite easy to get back to the subject again is because so many NHS employees, doctors, nurses, care workers, and NHS, and by NHS I include the care sector as well, do of course come from mainland Europe. And they're not going to go away. They're going to be there, and there's going to be the shortages of doctors, nurses, care workers, and so on, which gave rise to a lot of the immigration into Britain of the fellow EU citizens who took these jobs in the first place. And of course, what I found was really, really striking in the Brexit campaign over the last 2 or 3 years is that it's always the case, isn't it, that when you see something in your own community and in your own family, it's very different from a big national distant argument. When people started realizing that their care workers, a lot of their nurses, a lot of their doctors were European, and they were working as hard as anyone, doing a fantastic job and keeping the NHS afloat, people wanted that. They didn't want that to stop. And they're not going to want that to stop, are they, in the next few years either? So I think that all of our fellow NHS workers who are from mainland Europe themselves will be hugely important ambassadors for the European cause and for changing public attitudes over the next few years. And whilst I don't think that's an argument that will be at the forefront of people's minds while we're dealing with this COVID crisis, I think we can get the subject back to that quite quickly afterwards. And those all of those who are opinion formers in the NHS, which is practically anyone who deals with the public, which is most members of the NHS, are able to make this argument day by day to all of those who they live and work with. And I think that's going to be increasingly powerful.
Thank you.
And Geraint Talvan Davis, I think you've got some questions to ask as well.
Hi, Geraint. Are we going to find Geraint?
Yeah, Geraint, you're not quite unmuted.
Right, I'm unmuted. Excellent.
Perfect.
Geraint, hi. Great to be with you. I thought you were out there somewhere.
In the next couple of months, well, early in November, we're going to have an American presidential election. Should Biden win that election, and it's by no means certain, but should he win it, what impact do you think that will have on the debate within Europe, and particularly on the Brexit issue?
Well, can I first of all say, Geraint, thanks for everything you've been doing for Wales for Europe and keeping this campaign going in a really strong way over the last few years. And the fact we've got so many people on this call and that the organisation is in such good shape has got a great deal to do with you. So it's great you're with us this evening. Well, we're all hoping and praying that Biden wins, and it looks quite good at the moment. If he does, I think it's going to be a really significant factor, maybe a game changer, because the big problem at the moment is that the Boris Johnson project, isn't just a Brexit project, it's also a populist project. And that populist project is led by Trump. I mean, let's be clear what's going on. And it's a populist project that embraces Trump, it embraces Orban, it embraces the Poles, it embraces significant political parties across Europe. It embraces, quite significant leaders, country by country, including Salvini in Italy and so on. And if the head of that whole populist movement is removed, which is what will happen if Trump loses, then I think that will have a big impact on reducing, maybe eliminating a lot of the credibility and legitimacy of the Boris populist project. It's also going to have an immediate impact on policy, because of course I can't see a Biden presidency wanting to do a chlorinated chicken type trade deal with Boris Johnson. And when it comes to its international positioning, Biden, who is a mainstream internationalist Democrat, is going to want to get close to France and Germany and to their sensible leaders, Macron and Merkel, and he's not going to want to be swanning around the world with Boris Johnson and Putin. So that will make itself felt too. So both, as it were, the big ideological messaging level, where populism will be clearly in retreat if Trump loses, but also in terms of the actual policy of the United States from December, which I think will be to orient to the European mainstream and not to the Boris populist extreme. I think it could bring about quite a big change in attitudes quite quickly. So we need to hope and pray that Biden wins. Anyone who's got any time to get over there and help campaign in bits of the US should do so. And it could turn out to be a game changer.
Thank you. Helen, can I have a second bite of the cherry? I just wanted to bring this back to sort of, back to this country. When you look back over the last century, the Conservatives have been in office for far longer than the Labour Party has been in office. And yet the Labour Party seems reluctant to look fundamentally at constitutional change at the centre. I mean, Labour's gone along with and indeed legislated for devolution in Scotland and Wales. But it's a change in the voting system that would actually fundamentally alter the situation in this country. And I just wondering, that still doesn't seem to be on the cards in the next 10 years. It's not certainly not going to be in a Conservative manifesto, but would it even be in a Labour manifesto in 2024?
Well, voting reform is very tricky. Though, of course, you're leading the way because the Senate and the Scottish Parliament, and indeed the Mayoralty of London, all use proportional or more proportional voting systems. So there has been change, and of course they were introduced by the last Labour government. Of course, you've got a chicken and egg situation with electoral reform at Westminster, which is you've got to win a majority before you've got any chance of changing the system. Now, my view is, and that is what makes me cautious about going up front about making a really big thing about electoral reform, given that you've got to win under this system before you can change the system anyway. Not least because, of course, we did have that botched referendum in 2011 on changing the electoral system, and that wasn't a close result, unfortunately. I think it was 65-35 against any change. However, again, looking at the history and learning from it, the big mistake that was made was in the first year of the Blair government, when my great hero, Roy Jenkins, whose dad was a Welsh MP and who came from Pontypool, Roy Jenkins did his report on electoral systems, which recommended that we shift to a system quite close to the German system, that is single-member constituencies, but with a proportional top-up, as you have for the Senate elections. And I think it was a big, big mistake that there wasn't a move towards that system in Westminster when Roy Jenkins reported. I think it could probably have been done actually without a referendum then, just by a vote in Parliament, because it was obviously a fairer system than first past the post, but it wasn't done. And so, whereas I don't think it's a good idea to put electoral reform at the forefront of a manifesto for Westminster, given that you've got to win a majority in the current system, I do believe that once you have got the legitimacy that comes from having won under this system, then we should be much more open than we were before to changing the system, and doing so by a process of consultation between the parties, by a process of reflection, as happened with the Jenkins report in 1999, but not ducking the issue. And the fact that Wales and Scotland have been leading the way with reformed electoral systems, which will have been operating for a generation by the time there's a change of power in Westminster, I think will make the argument much easier to make next time around.
Thank you.
I think we have a question from Parik as well.
Yes, thank you, Helen. Andrew, you will obviously have seen the rising tide of enthusiasm for nationalism and independence in Scotland and in Wales. And I wondered, I was looking at the agenda for the TUC conference, which is happening currently. The TUC are discussing the rights of COVID workers, disability, LGBT. There's no squeak from the TUC conference on the rising tide of nationalism in Wales, the possibility of independence in Scotland, and aside from 4 references to Brexit in 66 items, there's no discussion about Brexit or otherwise. The 66th item that the TUC are discussing is Palestine. So my question is, how seriously could an external observer, and I'm from the south, I studied in Belfast, how seriously do you think I should take the trade union movement in Great Britain?
Well, it's clearly a very serious movement, and it has, you can't bring about big social and political change, in my experience, on the left, unless you've got the unions as part of the equation. You know, my book, which I've just done, Ernie Bevin, part of the reason I did it is he was an absolutely brilliant trade union leader and organiser who managed to translate that industrial organisation into politics as well, which is a good part of the reason why Labour won the 1945 election, was because of Ernie Bevin and the mobilisation of the trade unions. Do I believe the unions could be better led? Definitely, no doubt about that at all. We have a big, big problem of leadership of the major unions at the moment. I think Frances O'Grady, the head of the TUC, is very good, and she does cut through. But I think that Unite, Unison, and the GMB, the 3 biggest Labour-affiliated unions, haven't been well led over recent years. There's been nobody like Ernie Bevin who's been leading them. Len McCluskey, I'm afraid, who became essentially an extension of Jeremy Corbyn, I think did a very bad job for the union movement and the Labour Party. And we do need a new generation of good, strong leaders who, as you say, talk about the issues that really matter to people. To give an example, in the last chapter of my biography of Ernie Bevin, I talk about what would a Bevin of today be doing. And I've no doubt at all what a Bevin of today would be doing. There are 5 million workers out there who work in the gig economy, you know, employers like Uber, and in the care sectors, with very low levels of unionisation and very high levels of alienation, which of course is a big part of the reason why we got Brexit, is that they took out their alienation on the only thing that was available to them, which was to vote to leave the European Union. Now, an Ernie Bevin today would be mobilising really seriously, probably creating a new union, like the Transport and General Workers Union was in the 1920s, would be creating a big new union or unions to mobilise those gig workers and those care workers. And it would be on the basis of getting a better industrial deal for them, better paying conditions. I mean, gig workers don't even have proper employment status, which is a real scandal at the moment. And we've all seen through the COVID crisis how badly treated care workers are. So a better deal, a transformed deal for workers in these huge sectors. And of course, once you win their confidence to get a better deal for them in the workplace and at home, then of course it's possible to mobilise that as political support too, which is precisely what Ernie Bevin did, turning the Transport and General Workers Union not only into the biggest union in the country, which is what he did by mobilising in the big ununionised sectors in between the wars, but then also making this a major force behind the Labour Party. So your analysis about the weakness of the trade unions is spot on, but the conclusion I draw from it is that we need a new generation of effective leaders. And it may be that a lot of this has to come from the bottom up, people including members of Wales from Europe mobilising and organising in their workplace, you know, in care homes, in bits of the gig economy and so on. And out of that, we need a new trade unionism, which has got far more members, is far more relevant to people's lives, and starts making a much bigger political impact on the issues that really matter.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We're hearing a lot about, you know, this phrase "build back better." I'm wondering what you think the key ingredients of building back better are for a movement with our values, a movement that's pro-European, and what you think the key things we should be looking to achieve as we emerge out of the COVID crisis are?
Well, what I'm really struck by, what people are going to start to notice when we're not in the EU, is the loss of a lot of things that made a big difference in their own communities. that the EU did. All those structural funds, you know, all the way across Wales, people can point to things that happened because of the EU, with structural funds, with the Erasmus programme, with the ability to travel freely backwards and forwards and so on. And what we should be campaigning for all the time is for those policies to continue, even though we're not in the EU, which is why this big argument about what happens to regional development funds when we're out of the EU is so important. What's happened up till now with all these structural funds is that the priorities have been decided by the Senate in Wales in conjunction with the European Commission. And that's what's led to this big generation of projects that's taken place across Wales. Now, what the Senate should be campaigning for is for exactly the same relationship with the Westminster government. And if they don't get it, then that should be a massive source of campaigning, that we want to bring decisions on big infrastructure and community renewal projects much closer to the people, because the great irony of the EU is that it made them much closer, the decision making, to the people than does the government in Westminster. And as I said earlier, when it comes to schools, education institutions and all of that, we should again be seeking to replicate a lot of the relationships we had inside the EU, including student exchanges, including school twinning, including research partnerships, all of those elements which made the EU such a success. You know, there's that great line, isn't there, of Mahatma Gandhi, you should be the change that you want to see in the world. And now that we're leaving the EU, we should seek to replicate the EU-type relationships that we had with our European partners, both at institutional level and at national level, to the maximum extent that we can. And that, of course, will, over time, make the case for rejoining the EU stronger still.
Of course, leading on from that, one of the big frustrations that people have with the internal market bill and other regulation that's going through is that the mechanism to keep our relationship close, to keep our standards close, does seem to be absolutely under fire from the current government. So whilst we are in that challenging position where, you know, there's a lack of commitment to legislate for protections to stay the same, for standards to stay the same, for example. Who should we be working with? What relationships across Europe should we be trying to keep outside of government? What are the institutions we want to be connecting with?
Well, I think it's quite important that we remain as connected as possible with the institutions in Brussels. And actually, the Senate is in a very strong position to do that, because they were not a member of the European Union. It's a big, self-confident, governmental and representative organisation, the Senate. And it can't be stopped from having an office and a presence in Brussels and organising exchanges, lobbying the EU institutions, doing all of those things. So I think in Wales, in many ways, you're in a better position because you've got the Senate and the government the government, the devolved government, to be able to do that. And I would make it a big issue in the forthcoming Welsh elections that candidates commit that they will maintain strong relationships with the European institutions. And as I say, then when it comes to other institutions at a more local level, schools, hospitals, colleges, universities, companies, all of those, seeing that they maintain strong relationships with European counterparts, I think is going to be important too. Over time, I think that could help to change the climate of the debate quite rapidly, particularly if quite quickly people perceive that economically and socially we're starting to suffer from leaving the EU. And I think, you know, for example, you said earlier that the Conservatives think they might do quite well in the Senate elections. Well, in due course, they're going to have to start defining what their policies are going to be then, if they were to gain power in Wales. And I think you can press them quite hard then on whether they're going to be, you know, endorsing the European approach to structural funds, to partnership and research and development and student exchanges and all of that. So there's a lot of scope, I think, particularly with the devolved institutions, for maintaining strong links with the European institutions even after the United Kingdom has formally left the European Union.
We've just had a question from Ed Sides on that note. Anita, can we unmute Ed? And this will probably be one of our last questions. So if there is a question you'd like to get in before we close, if you could let us know as soon as possible. Sorry, Ed.
Yeah, just my question is to do with, there's been a headline about, you know, the human rights and stuff, and people forget we're still members of the Council of Europe and under the ambit of the European Court on Human Rights, which I think a lot of people who were voting to leave thought they were, you know, concerned about judgments of the European Court of Human Rights rather than judgments of the European Court of Justice. Do you think there's going to be a serious threat to us being pulled out of Council of Europe and the ECHR?
Well, thanks for that question, Ed. I'm a member of the Council of Europe, and I went on it because it is the last of the great European institutions, of which Britain continues to be a member, and we send a parliamentary delegation to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to meet physically because of COVID, but it's still there and it's taking up big issues. I think it's going to be quite difficult for the Tories to leave the Council of Europe whilst they're trying to make big arguments with Russia and China about human rights, is my reading of it. But again, it's very important we carry on making that argument. Now, I all the time link our credibility in standing up to this new generation of great dictators, Xi and Putin, and now Erdogan in Turkey too, constantly make that argument as an argument about the rule of law and human rights underpinned by the Council of Europe. So it's clearly there are a lot of Tories who want to get out of the Council of Europe and want to take Britain out of the European Convention on Human Rights, but they haven't actually made any move in that direction. And I think that could be, if I can sort of use an analogy, that could be over the next few years quite a big Trojan horse for us in terms of getting back into the other European institutions too. The fact that we are still very much members of the Council of Europe. I was very struck by the fact, as I've come to understand how the Council works, because I've only just been on it a few months, that the leader of the British delegation to the Council of Europe, Sir Roger Gale, who's a Conservative MP, because it's always the governing party that leads the British delegation, he was one of the rebels yesterday. And his argument was that he couldn't support the traducing of international law by Boris Johnson as a member of the Council of Europe, which preaches human rights and international law to the rest of the world. I thought that was very striking, and we should be making that argument too. And you're absolutely right to highlight it, Ed, because it's going to be a really crucial agenda in the next few years, not least because the issues that the Council of Europe deals with, which are issues to do with human rights and liberty, are absolutely at the centre of the European debate at the moment, because of Putin, Xi, Erdogan, and this ring of dictators who are encircling Europe, and who it's absolutely essential that we contain if we're not going to see a major threat to democracy in Europe in the generation ahead.
Thank you.
I think it's good to sort of come back to Europe and the EU itself to close. What do you see as being the main challenges and the main changes that we might be seeing within the EU itself over the coming years, and how might they affect our work as Wales for Europe and campaigning organisations, and indeed the relationship between the UK and the EU?
Well, there are three things that are really striking, aren't there, at the moment? The first is that the EU itself has a big problem with populism. We are overwhelmed with it here because we have Johnson and Cummings. But if you look at Hungary, Poland, some of the forces in Italy, even the AfD in Germany, this is a big issue across Europe. Now, it's so far the centre of gravity of the European Union has remained thoroughly sensible, moderate and progressive. And we should thank our lucky stars. The two predominant leaders in the European Union are Chancellor Merkel, who is absolutely brilliant as a champion of European values and sensible, rational European policy, and Emmanuel Macron, who adopts a similar position in France. But clearly the EU has got to contain and deal with populism, and it needs to do it by being particularly economically successful. So it gets at the roots of populism, which is economic dislocation. So that's point one, and that's a big challenge for Europe. Point two, of course, is the euro and making a success of the Eurozone. And that is still very much work in progress in the European Union. If you look at the last 10 years, though the euro has survived, the Greek crisis and the problems of aligning a fixed exchange rate system across very different economies is still a very real one. And the third issue is post-COVID growth. And this development of what's essentially a Marshall Plan for Europe, this huge European rescue fund, which the French and the Germans led, but which is now going to spread across the EU, is, I think, a very, very positive force in the EU, because I think that's what may make it possible for the euro to survive, because there is some redistribution between the richer and the poorer nations in Europe. But how successful the EU is and the European institutions in Brussels are at leading mainland Europe out of COVID and into growth is going to be vital, both for the European Union itself, but also in Britain, to us making the case for Europe. Because what I think is going to happen in Britain isn't just that we're going to suffer a Brexit loss next year as we leave the integrated European economy, but we have this ludicrously incompetent and malevolent government, which has been very, very bad at dealing with COVID-19 itself and the plans for post-COVID-19. And it looks to me as if the big rescue and recovery programs that the EU is putting in place, including this massive fund, this Marshall-type fund they put together, looks to be a lot more progressive and far-sighted than anything that's happening in Britain. And the stronger the EU recovery from COVID, the stronger the case for staying close to the EU and ultimately rejoining it will be in Britain. And I'm hopeful because, you know, the essential leaders of the EU, and the two most important ones being Macron and Merkel, are really first-rate people who basically share progressive, enlightened European values of a kind that we used to have in this country until we got this wave of populists, which began to be blunt with Nigel Farage and the growth of UKIP, with the Thatcherite wing of the Conservative Party 20 years ago. So the omens are promising in the EU, but we need to wish them well and do all we can to help those positive forces that want to contain populism on the continent, make a success of the euro, and have the strongest possible European-wide growth coming out of COVID-19. And in all of those respects, then, the European Union and mainland Europe will be an object lesson to us in how to go about having a well-governed country. There you are, that's the optimistic scenario.
I was going to ask you if you thought the EU would be willing to take us back after the blame and provocation, but instead of asking that, I think Sally Stevenson has put in a really good question to round us off, to take us back to exactly where we are now. So Sally.
Okay, can you hear me?
Hi Sally, I can hear you very clearly.
Lovely. Hi Andrew. Yeah, just to finish off really, we've only got 15 weeks left until transition ends. So where do you think we'll end up on the 1st of January? Do you think we will leave with no deal as the government seems to be positioning us for, or do you think they'll pull off some sort of last minute fudge of a deal that tries to minimise the damage that leaving is going to cause?
I would be very surprised if we leave with no deal. And my reading of what Johnson is doing is exactly what he did a year ago, which is loads of ludicrous brinkmanship, which he did last year in all the no deal planning and all of that, but then a last minute deal, because he knows that if there are 30-mile tailbacks at Dover and food shortages in the shops and a hard border in Ireland, happens, that at that point the whole Brexit thing will implode. I mean, if there is no deal next January and all those sorts of things start to happen, I think Brexit will unravel very fast, and he knows that. So I think what we're seeing, and I think this internal markets bill and all this business about withdrawing from the Northern Ireland Protocol, I don't think he's intending to do any of it. It's all a ludicrously OTT megaphone diplomacy to get a Canada-type trade deal that means we have free trade in goods, so no tariffs, quotas, or form filling at the border, which means that trade isn't interrupted, trade in goods isn't interrupted in January, though of course there are lots of other downsides of leaving the EU. That's my reading of the situation. Now, the problem when you're playing Russian roulette, as he is that it can go wrong. So there's still a chance he could end up in no deal by mistake, because his brinkmanship goes badly wrong over the next 15 weeks. I don't think that'll happen. I think what will happen is something like a Canada deal, where we therefore don't face a cliff edge in January, but nonetheless, we will be, over time, progressively worse off. I think that's the situation we're looking at. But as I say, the malevolence and incompetence of Johnson and Cummings is limitless. And if they were to, by mistake, end up in no deal, then we need to be prepared to mobilise public opinion on that very fast, because of course what they'll try and do is blame that on the EU and somehow turn this into Dunkirk. I mean, that's what will happen. And we need to make it very clear that this is the fault of this malevolent government in Downing Street and not the EU. And what we need is decent leaders. And if I could just end up with a final plug for my book, part of the reason I wrote it is that we need decent leaders. Our big problem in Britain in the last 5 years, maybe longer than that, is we haven't had strong leaders. Ernie Bevan knew what it was like. I'm happy to send copies to anybody who'd like it, but the real reason I'm busy promoting it is my own views. Until we get proper, effective leadership, we're not going to be able to put right the fundamental problems that we face at the moment. Let's be absolutely blunt about it. For as long as Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are running this country, it doesn't matter whether we have a deal or don't have a deal, we're still going to be in a bad place. So ultimately, we've got to get a new and better generation of leaders in place in our political parties and then in the country at large. And once we do that, we'll not only be better off in the short term, but hopefully part of what those good leaders will do is to take us back into the European Union, which is what Wales for Europe stands for and what we all want to see happen, let's hope, over the next decade or so. On that note, it's been really great to be with you. Thanks for bearing with me over the last hour. And all the best with your campaigning. And as soon as we're allowed to get out and about, I'll be back in Wales and we'll do some real live meetings with real live people. Thanks.
Thank you. We very much look forward to that, Andrew. And thank you for sort of an informative and a wide-ranging, but above all, an optimistic hour and a half. I think we really all need that at the moment, and to be reassured that we do need to keep talking, we do need to keep asking the questions, we do need to keep speaking up and speaking out, and you know, to be reminded that this is a political campaign, but it's also a social and a cultural campaign as well, and there's plenty of work to be done on lots of different fronts. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us, and thank you for all your work and campaigning and speaking up over the last few years. I'm sure that's not going to end anytime soon. And also thank you to everybody else for joining us this evening. I think it's always heartening for me to see how many people come to these events, how many people are still interested, engaged, and really wanting to keep this campaign going and to keep the European flame burning in any way that we can. There is still work to be done. We will be doing it at Wales for Europe. If you want to be more involved, if you want to keep up to date, I think Sean has put the link to the newsletter in the chat once more. And if you are able to make even just a small donation to us, we'd be very grateful, and the link is in the chat as well. So diolch yn fawr. Noswaith dda, diolch eto, Andrew, and I'm sure we'll see you all soon, whether that's online or hopefully in person before too long.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Wales for Europe, and look forward to being with you again soon. Bye, everyone.